I started out life with Aldi, then Tesco, Travelodge, Prezzo, and now with Butlin.
Are you someone that takes yourself too seriously?
I do hope not. It's impossible to do so and succeed, I think.
You make decisions as a top management, but somehow it doesn't happen.
It turned out we were more profitable when we were open than when we were closed. So that was quite important for us.
Yeah, but that one. Today, we're going to uncover the secrets of leadership from two incredible guests. Jon Hendry-Pickup, CEO of Butlins and former leader at Tesco, Travelodge and Prezzo, who's navigated change across various industries, and Professor Christian Stadler, corporate strategy expert from Warwick Business School, who researches what it takes for companies to not just survive, but thrive in today's markets. So I'd like to take this opportunity for you guys to welcome you both, firstly,
Thank you.
And give some space to introduce yourselves and talk about the beginning of your journeys as leaders. So Jon, why don't we start with you? Where did it all begin for you?
Okay, so I've worked for 30 years now in consumer-facing businesses, and they've all had similar traits, I guess, in the sense that they've been high-volume, mass-market businesses that I've worked in. So after being a consultant, I started out life with Aldi, then Tesco, Travelodge, Prezzo, and now with Butlin. So everything has been consumer-facing, although obviously the sectors have been different.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. And Christian, what sparked your interest in this area in the first place?
Okay, so I'm obviously not a leader. Yeah, I'm a professor for a reason. Yeah, I like being, somebody you can advise, who has an opinion on stuff without having to do what Jon has to do, push everyone into line as well. Certainly my preference. Started after the PhD. I've written the first book about how companies succeed 100 years and longer, which was doing quite well. And that gave me the opportunity to also start working with companies and not just do research with them.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much. So I guess that leads us quite nicely into my first question, because when you're talking about the longevity of organizations, I suppose a lot of that must come down to the leader or leaders involved. And so what do you think, just to kick off our chat today, what do you think it takes for a leader to be able to support that longevity and ensure it?
So one thing I would say is they shouldn't take themselves too serious in the sense of thinking they're the only ones who know everything. And, that means, you find nice ways to engage your team, maybe even beyond that, because there's blind spots that naturally develop if you work for long periods of time together in a small team, If you use some of techniques that you can bring in people from middle management, maybe get an opinion from customers from the front line, that helps you quite a bit, in prolonging the life of your organization.
Fantastic. So, Jon, how would you say that trait is reflected in your journey? Are you someone that takes yourself too seriously?
I do hope not. It's impossible to do so and succeed, I think, because, as Christian said, if you look at the volume of data that's available for businesses today, if you look at the rate of change, if you look at how consumers act and what they have at their fingertips now versus what happened before, the amount of information you have to try and take on board in order to run an organization is vast, and you can't do that on your own. It's almost an impossible concept that you've got the single all-seeing leader who runs an organization without a team. I just don't think that exists. And so therefore it's absolutely vital from my perspective that I get it right with my team, they get it right with their team, and so on and so on. You think about an organization like ours, it's one of the things I love about this, which is you generally entrust the relationship with the guest day to day to the least qualified, lowest paid people in your business. And as a consequence of that, you can't possibly be in a position where you decide everything from the top of an organization. You have to be able to get your team on board. You have to make sure that they understand what they're doing. You have to give them the confidence to do the job, to make decisions, to make mistakes and move forward.
So how is it that you want that team to look around you? Because if you look at it like a pyramid, right, and you've got all these different stages and everybody will be leading something until, exactly how you say it, the frontline facing staff. Who is it important to have in the room with you on this journey?
For me, a breadth of opinion is critical, and also people who are willing to stand up for what it is that they want to try to achieve themselves. So I have 10 people in my team, and I've got a combination of people who've been with the business for 30 years, as well as people who've been with the business for 12 months. And I think the combination of those things, their ability to have a view on what it is that they need to do, and their ability to work with the rest of the people in the team to disagree when they need to disagree, and to push through things and fight things out where we need to in order to get the best outcome for the business, I think is really critical. I think if we're in a position where everybody agrees with each other, everybody sounds the same and everybody has the same opinion, well, that's not really where we're going to get to the right outcomes.
And what does your experience, Christian, say in that department about, who you surround yourself with?
So I bring in some very new, unusual voice. I've done an experiment for about a year or so with Gieswein, a company that makes sort of upper-end organical type sneakers of wool, where I joined their management team meetings armed with ChatGPT for about a year, and we kind of looked what happened. Now, one thing that happened early on, I think it was right from the first meeting where we did this, that I felt would be a nuisance for them, is that it's highly disruptive in the sense that, you go in a meeting where these people have been working together for many years, they know each other really well. I come, have fed the agenda into ChatGPT, and then somewhere in the midst of this meeting, I just sort of, push 5 pages on the table and say, read this. And that I thought they'll hate it, Turns out they really loved it. And they really loved it for the reason that they were saying this was making them stop and rethink. And it's not as if what ChatGPT brought to them would be so revolutionary, absolutely new, but it simply kind of helped them not to run through things as they would routinely do because they've worked so well. So I'm not sure if John have ever experimented with something like this, but I felt, it's a really cool thing to use new technology as a new voice.
Yeah, so it's not like just maybe fostering some kind of continuous learning and keeping things different, are we saying, in those meetings, and mixing it up a little bit and posing new challenges?
Yeah, and sort of not just run through, these two brothers who run the company, and they can complete each other's sentences.
Right.
So you would know, I say this will happen from the other side, and then we find agreement here. But there's something kind of fresh, which helps them to maybe think about other perspectives. For example, during this year, one of the massive decisions for them was around whether they want to close the manufacturing at their core headquarters and turn into logistics site. It's a massive thing for an organization and very emotional. This kind of, kept them analytical, brought in these sort of additional sort of perspectives, and they found really useful during this journey.
So I can imagine that is the kind of culture that you foster when you're saying about the breadth of experience. We're talking about diversity in a experience sense, and you say you've had people with you for years and 12 months. Would you say that fosters the kind of continuous learning culture that you're looking for?
I hope so, although I'm really interested in that idea there, because there is always a danger that you can get caught into the normal day-to-day washing machine of a business, whereby you sit and look at the things that you look at, and it's impossible to look at everything. And so therefore focused on the stuff that really matters within the business. And a reminder of that, I think, is quite critical. It's very difficult for everybody to sit in that room and be totally objective about what it is that we've been working on. So I really like that as an idea about being able to keep people in line.
Yeah.
There are a million things that we could spend our time on. And what's really critical, I always liked Warren Buffett's quote where he said the role of the CEO is to say no to almost everything. And I think there is an element of that that's true here, that says, okay, fundamentally, you have to, as a business, make sure you're really clear on where you're trying to get to and the reasons behind that, and the difference between your strategy and the direction in which the company goes, and how you manage trading on a day-to-day basis is crucial. And so I like that. I'm going to have a look at that, Christian. I think that sounds great.
And I mean, that's an extreme example, yeah. But I think there's smart techniques also how you can bring in middle management in the room. I've worked with a large organization in Dubai now for a while, and they have faced a change in the environment that is substantial, that requires them to make adjustments. They also have a couple of departments where there is sort of natural some competition for resources, etc. Yeah, and it's less about what to do, but how can we do it so that people buy in and they don't let initiative fizzle out. Yeah? I'm sure you're familiar with this. Yeah, you make decisions as a top management, but somehow it doesn't happen, and it's often sort of middle management doesn't like it. And what I did as I worked with them is I set up first a survey that kind of gathered the opinions on trends from different parts of the organization, that they got a first feeling. But then, I think that's the more crucial part, we went into a workshop where we together, middle management, top management, started to work on, okay, what is it that we do well? What do these trends tell us? Where should we set priorities? And started to find already through the creation of strategy common ground, and hence, made it easier subsequently to implement these ideas as well.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because you talk about the kind of stages down in that way. And, often if an idea or some kind of fundamental change is coming in, it will start at the top. But of course, that's where it came from. So everybody up there thinks it's a great idea. And then as you get further down, everyone gets more kind of anti-change and anti. So how do you foster leadership in leaders, the other leaders, as you work your way down an organisation?
I think this is a really crucial challenge for organisations now, because I don't think it's necessarily that we have a leadership team who are all forward-looking and are accepting of change and happy to manage all of that. That's the same through an organisation. Everyone is facing into, this is a complex situation, this is something coming at me from the outside, this is what I'm hearing from our guests, and this is what I've experienced and I've done well in the past. And everybody's been on their own management journey. And so I think what tends to happen is people have their own interpretation of what goes on. I think the closer we can get to our management teams in the organisation, particularly the ones who face the guests or who manage the direct team members, the better it is. And we've done quite a lot of work on flattening our structures, on making sure that, for example, we've done a leadership development program recently, which has been led in every session by a member of the leadership team. And I think that level of connection with the team is really critical. And how you manage that loop of information so that managers within the organisation feel they have input into what's happening, what we're doing, this works, this doesn't work. So being really overt with, this is the style of feedback that we want, this is how we're going to run the organisation, so that they understand that as well, is a crucial part of it. So there's a number of layers around communication, training, how you put the message out about what you're trying to achieve, and also how we design when we land new change, what that's going to look like for team members in their jobs day to day.
It sounds like the training that you mentioned there, that could be something that and maybe other organisations haven't considered, but utilising the leaders that you have and that visibility, that must create and foster some kind of a deeper connection maybe to the culture across the board. Is that something that you've found?
Yes, that was part of the purpose of doing it in the first place. I'm sure we're not the first people who've done exactly that. I think that's what was important, though, and it was hard work, actually, because the time commitment was big. But I think the connection between the people who were in the room who were delivering the training and the people who were receiving it, it wasn't a straightforward stand up and listen for 2 hours and that's it. It was interactive as it has to be. And it fleshed out a number of questions about why are we doing things this way when in the past this worked. And I'm sure Christian will be able to talk about that with organisations as they've evolved over time, is that things that were successful at one point in time and people who've been there have been successful with don't necessarily get you where you need to get to in the future. And so evolving that so that somebody can say, okay, I was successful in this way, but now I need to change that a bit and I need to work in this direction, is something that's requires close relationships.
Yeah, and what's your take on that, Christian?
I'm interested actually in something. I'd like to ask Jon about this. Yeah, how do you make sure in these sessions that people are not, maybe afraid is too strong a word, yeah, but if I sit a little bit further down in the organization, I naturally would like to please my bosses. Hence, I will find it hard typically to say things that are uncomfortable for those leaders. So how do you manage to do this in these sessions that people really feel like they can speak openly, but yet not turn into purely a complaint session, yeah, because that's not helpful either.
Yeah, absolutely. And we saw that at first. There was a degree of reticence to start with, but there were 9 sessions that everybody went on. And so therefore, as we evolve over time, so at the end of each one, we would put together information from what people said and feed back to them. We would continue those conversations in the following ones and the discussions would pick up. And we had to brief ourselves really on, this is the style we need to go in with, this is how we need to be receptive to what the team are talking about, how do we take asides to ensure we have a discussion on something that really matters to people in the team. So I think as time went on, first of all, they were on 9 sessions each. And secondly, word of mouth, they got into a conversation that said, okay, everybody is up for a discussion here about how we take this forward and how we make sure everybody succeeds.
I like that a lot, yeah, this sort of time aspect. I mentioned this organization in Dubai I worked with, and the executive team initially was quite afraid that this just becomes okay, everyone can complain here for a day. But turned out that people in the middle management were really appreciative that they could have a voice, yeah, and they did not expect that they will make decisions either. Yeah, it's really, I can, get hurt. People take me serious, and sort of subsequently, as time progressed, and we did more of these engagements, bring them together, everyone became more and more comfortable with, and that resonates really well with what you were saying as well. If you do it just as a one-off publicity stunt, not likely to work, but if you create an environment where this can happen a bit more regular, then you get real benefits from it.
And the reason I ask about whether you've seen a kind of more closeness with the culture is every one of these that I've ever had in my career, it's been, we're putting this on for you. Here's some external person who you've never met and you'll never see again, and they're going to tell us what you said today, and they'll probably go back with one list of complaints and one list of positives, and it does feel very separate from what you do, and they call them trainers or whatever else, coaches, and they might come in a day and offer those, but it really makes you feel quite separate from whatever this goal is, because that individual is separate from the goal. Has there been a change in your approach to fostering culture across the different businesses that you've been with, based on, I don't know, whether it's the size or the purpose of each business, and how have you had to adapt between each one?
It's been tricky in some ways, but I've come into different businesses at different stages of their cultural evolution. So if I think about Tesco and where Tesco was in the time that I was there, Tesco could almost do no wrong at the time, but that was where the business was at the time. And so therefore, from my perspective, I came in with a business that was very much on the front foot and had a very specific way of doing things. And so there was an element of me adapting to that. And it's an enormous organization. And whilst I ran a decent sized business myself within that, I was not sat on the board. I wasn't running a country. I wasn't doing something like that. So I was adapting my style to what I was doing there. That's very different from what I was brought in to do here with Butlins, because Butlins was in a position where it wasn't really clear what it was going to be. This is a 90-year-old business now, so therefore there is an element of resilience and longevity that sits within that. But I think the direction and purpose that the business had picked at that point in time, it wasn't really clear on where it was going, what it was trying to do. Where the team had got to with how they were trying to position it certainly wasn't resonating with the guests when we talked about it. So there was an expectation from my point of view that I, first of all, helped to set the direction that we were going to go in, and also then worked on how the culture needed to evolve in order to deliver against that.
Yeah, and work with it, right? Because presumably when you're looking at the longevity again, at what point is there a right time to pivot? Is there a bad time to pivot? How do you make those adjustments as an organization?
It works best if there's real trouble, yeah. And the larger the organization, the more true it is, because very large organizations hard to turn around, make substantial changes, and it's when they really hit with a crisis point that they can make substantial changes. I spent some time in Shell and written in my PhD, also in that book, about them. They had a point in 1999 when the oil price dropped below $10 a barrel, which, in good years, recently we have been close to $100 a barrel. So you can imagine how bad $10 per barrel is. The entire industry that year lost 500,000 jobs. Now, at this point in time, a company like Shell, they had enough reserves which they could flush into the system to smooth over. But the people in charge, they decided to do the opposite. Yeah, they really wanted the organization to feel the pain, so they could make some changes that meant centralizing a little bit. Yeah, it's a very decentralized organization historically, and they wanted to have more sort of regional responsibilities than just country responsibilities. I don't think they would have been able, without this crisis, to ever get to this point. What in Europe, for example, was a term was the barons of Europe for those who headed the big countries out here, and without them being in a situation where they were really worried, they would have not given up any power. So timing, very crucial.
Because as a living, breathing human being, my perception and the way that people in my circles have spoken about Butlins has certainly shifted, maybe in the last 10 years. And then obviously in the middle of all that, you've had COVID. And so what has it gone from and to? How has that mission looked?
It's interesting listening to Christian's conversation about the oil industry and what happened there. And it's almost a shame in some ways that companies have to get to a point where things are really difficult for them to make some change. You sort of see why that is. People have been successful in what they've done in the past and they want to cling on to that. Whereas actually, if you look at what happened with Butlins over time, it was a real pioneer in the UK in the 30s, the 40s, the 50s about what it was. This was an aspirational period of time when most of the population were looking to try to spend more free time, more leisure time, more time with their families and so on, in the same way that the landed classes, for want of a better description back then, had done in previous years. And Billy Butlin did a very good job of being very accessible and very egalitarian in the way that he wanted to work. If you look at his advertising from the late 40s, he talked about a week's holidays for a week's wages. He was very focused on what he was trying to achieve then, and that continued for some time, and he was successful. And then, of course, things had to pivot because cheap holidays to Europe became a thing. Package holidays became more popular, and of course, whilst we have beautiful coastlines in the UK, we don't always have beautiful weather. And as a consequence, people would say, okay, well, I want some sun. Mm-hmm. And so I think as a consequence of that, the business hadn't really figured out how to pivot to match that. And it tried lots of different things, not always successfully. It even rebranded for a period of time, which was, for a business with universal awareness, that feels like a really strange decision to me, because most businesses spend their entire existence trying to get that for their company and fail and don't achieve that. So that was strange. But then I think it required a degree of focus to say, okay, what are we going to be and how are we going to get there and what's the market and where do we win? And that was the exercise that we did. We did a very big market positioning and segmentation exercise in 2018, 2019, which cost an inordinate amount of money to do it, but it was definitely worthwhile to try and understand what the scale of the market was, where could we win, where could we carve out our own position, and that's what we've really been focused on.
Because if you look, I mean, just this week, I've been reading about Skype. Do you remember Skype? The video calling, and Skype were like the first, they were the pioneers, right? And then COVID happened, and you would think that they would have updated their software in the last however long it was, but everybody else then overtook them, and Skype's closing now. And there was a real sweet spot there when it was a sink or swim kind of moment, I feel, and then this video calling being so accessible now, and then to just kilter off, I suppose it's the what happens in those critical moments that I'm interested in. And so if we take your experience with Butlins and you're there and you're trying to get the ball rolling and having this shift, then COVID hits. I mean, what did that look like?
Well, that was terrifying for a short period of time, because all of the we were part of Born Leisure at the time, so there were 3 businesses. We were family owned, and we went from being tremendously successful across the 3 businesses to being in a position where we were about 67 days from running out of money, and that's a terrifying position to be in, but it does really focus the mind on what's important right now. And so once we'd figured out with the Bank of England something that gave us some continuity, we then looked very closely about what does reopening mean. And actually that changed the perspective on how guests were going to navigate the resorts and what we were able to do there. And one of the things that was critical for us was capacity. Now, at the time, if you remember the 2-metre rule that then became a 1-metre rule that then became 2 metres again, and all that type of stuff that was happening around then. But capacity became the most important thing for us in order to be able to deliver a profitable reopening. And actually that stuck with us further down the line. So not just understanding the brand, but also understanding the technicalities of how each of the resorts have worked. So we've redesigned what we've done in the resorts in order to be able to deliver capacity, i.e., guests able to do a whole range of things at the same time across the resort, which we hadn't really focused on previously. But now it's become a really core part of what we do.
And to what extent there was a nervousness for a long time, and bans around travelling, but possibly still an option to stay in the country? And presumably it gave people an opportunity to have those breaks still. So was that a defining moment as well when you were reopening?
We'd had some challenges previously with not being open all of the time. So part of what happened before was the management team acted more like it was a caravan park rather than it was a resort business. And we said, well, we need to be open all the time and be accessible. So actually we did that in 2022 and 23. So therefore, that was the thing that changed for us more than anything else. A lot of other businesses did well in the UK, holiday businesses in the UK, because they got a COVID bounce. No one could go overseas, or it was too expensive, or it was restricted. And so therefore, if you look at holiday cottages and businesses like that, there was no more capacity, but they just put their prices up massively. And so they did really well in those years, but obviously that settles down afterwards. For us, we actually increased our capacity because we just opened where we were closed. And it turned out that, and this won't be the most surprising thing you hear all day, but it turned out we were more profitable when we were open than when we were closed. So that was quite important for us.
Yeah,
but
write that one down.
That was exactly that won't be the most surprising thing I say all day. But that was the big change for us, really. And so it just happened at the time when people were coming back out of COVID.
And has that shifted anything across the organisation, like with the culture? Is it moving from, like you say, the caravan park to the resort? Is it feeling more like that across the board now with everybody?
I think everybody's clear on the fact that we are set up to do what it is that we're supposed to do. From a guest point of view, we're here to be the home of entertainment. That's what we describe ourselves as, because we're very much high energy, lots of activity, give me loads of things to do both day and night. That's what our guests are looking for, which is very different. It pulls us quite a long way apart from what people do with caravan parks or centre parks or the likes. All good businesses, just different from what we're doing. So it allowed us to sharpen up very much on the things that only we can do.
And so what shift have you seen, Christian, when you're looking at longevity of businesses? Was that COVID a kind of make or break time for many?
So first, I need to add that I'm still one of these last standing Skype users, and I just had to switch. Yeah, my mom back in Austria, she can only handle a traditional phone, so WhatsApp calls is not an option. I did my first non-Skype call in years with her yesterday, so adjusting on that. So is COVID any different now? Interesting enough, I would say if I look historically, there have been dramatics up and downs at many points in time, and we always overestimate the crisis we're in right now. Hence, there's some sort of consistency how we can walk through those things, because look back, Second World War, rise of new technology. Now we speak of AI, but there was a time without internet, there was a time without computers. All of these adjustments were really dramatic. Now, so what does help, more generally speaking, regardless of whether it's COVID or not? One thing that I've noticed that businesses who do better than others is those who make sure that they don't just explore and innovate, but they're really clear about how they can translate those new innovative ideas into something they can sell and make money out. Yeah, so this exploitation, the non-sexy business part is very crucial. Now, if I translate that to the flashy thing at the moment, to AI, rather than just thinking, do I do a massive AI project and spend millions, why don't I just get my people to use it as a substitute for Google for a while, and they get used to this technology, and then we can start to think about, are there any adjustments in the way we do things, the processes, which are more small scale, to get some wins? It's probably smarter than trying to reinvent everything right now, because this is a sexy new technology. But back to your first question, I don't think that COVID changed everything. Yeah, there's always dramatic things. At the moment, I would argue, the sort of re-emergence of politics in the business world, in the Western world, that's really new. I think many emerging economies have always been used to this, that if you don't have a good connection to the politicians, you'll be in trouble, but that's somewhat, well, I'm exaggerating. I think it always mattered to some extent, but it's more noticeable and more dramatic at the moment with particularly, these overnight shifts that we get from the White House.
Yeah. Daily. So, Jon, I wonder then, when you're talking about the bigger picture and the bigger package that Butlins is at its core, and we're looking at staycations, you were saying about certainly after COVID and before you guys were open all year, everybody else did very well. I wondered what the influence of the rise in things like Airbnbs have been? Because again, they're not doing the package. That's the point of difference. It's somewhere to stay. But has that had much influence on how you guys operate?
I think that the UK staycation market is always something that has been quite vibrant. And we can see that with the likes of Airbnb. You can see it with budget hotels, so the likes of Travelodge and Premier Inn and so on. And caravan parks have always been quite a big part of what people have done by the coast. So I think that's always been quite vibrant. People have said to me, do you think that now that everybody's going overseas again, that UK holidays will shrink? I don't see these things as a zero-sum game at all. And certainly the research has said that over the next 5 years that both of those areas will grow, both overseas and the UK. And the pace at which they grow, that will depend on a number of factors, but both are likely to grow. We've seen this post-2008, actually, where families tended to prioritise the family holiday over buying things. And that started really heavily then. And that's played out through the 2010s, and it's still very much the case now. When we talk to guests and we look at sentiment of guests, even this year when things are still quite difficult, particularly for the lower affluence range of UK consumers, they're still prioritising the family holiday comes first. That's something that we're going to do. They may cut out a bunch of other things. They may also shrink it. So it might not be 2 weeks, it might be 1 week, or it might be 4 days rather than 7. But that focus is still very much there. So from my point of view, I don't think the rise of things like Airbnb have change the market. What it says to me is that this is a space that is worth us being in. This is not something which is flattening out. This is something which continues to grow, and we need to be able to provide what we do for the people who are on the mission that they're on when they come to us, which is different from I'm going to go and relax and explore and not see anybody else, which other people do really well, but that's something we won't do. Yeah. And I think that's strategically quite critical, is to be as clear on what you're not doing as what you are doing.
Yeah, no, I like that. What would you say about
as
that?
somebody
really
with a strategy hat on, what I really like about Butlins is that they have something that they offer that is unique. It's so easy to do what everyone else does, but being able to find a niche and also having the matching portfolio of resources and capabilities to deliver this, that's the winning spot. And I see that exactly with this entertainment space at home in the UK when no one else is doing it. And even if others try to do it, they will not have the same history, they will not have the same experience in doing it, hence they're unlikely to pull it off the same way as you do, Jon.
Yeah, because it's all you, of course. I was wondering, I'm hearing more and more about individual events that at Butlins, it's like, I'm going to go spend my 30th, or there was an 80s night I heard about maybe 2 months ago that I had so many people socially just chatting to me about. And I wonder, is there been a change in the events, or am I just getting older and more people are talking about the 80s to me? Like, what is the priority at the moment on the events? Is that something that stands alone without going to stay?
Throughout the year, as we're open for the whole of the year, we can't just have people on school holidays because they're not on holidays the whole time. So what else are we going to do? And each of these areas, big weekenders, which is what you're describing, but also showtime breaks, which is term time below school age kids, they've existed before. But what we haven't done, and I think it goes back to Christian's point before about execution of the strategy, is how do we make sure we drill that through to our guests so they understand what that's about? Because you're saying that you're hearing more about 80s weekends and various other bits. That's true. What is still amazing to me is the number of people, even though they've heard of Butlins, have not heard about the fact that we do these big weekenders. So being able to pinpoint and be specific on what they are, and also get that message out to guests in the most cost-effective way that we can, has been a really critical part of the last few years. And defining what we're about has been a real big focus for the team, because defining the strategy, even though, like I said, it was expensive and complex, that took probably 6 months. I think this bit takes 10 years. Yeah. Because to really make sure you hone that and get that home to guests and refine that, improve it to give them exactly what they want and take away the stuff that they don't want, that's 10 years plus. And arguably, I'm sure you'd have a view on this, Christian, but arguably it's forever.
Yeah.
Do you get lots of guests from outside the UK, or is primarily from the UK?
It's all UK. So we have virtually, well, we have no inbound traffic, but we'll have people who are staying in the UK or resident in the UK who are from overseas who will come, but there's no inbound. So it's a really interesting balance because everybody in the UK knows Butlins. Almost nobody outside of the UK knows Butlins. I remember having that conversation with the cohort in the MBA at the business school. And I asked who's heard of Butlins, and it divided the audience really clearly. People knew it really clearly from childhood, and then others had never heard of it at all, other than looking at what we were talking about on the day.
Have you been thinking that you could become an interesting experience for non-British people, because you offer the sort of quintessential UK experience for those who are not from the UK?
That is what it is.
Yeah,
or that wouldn't work?
It might do. At the moment, not yet, because if we think about the market sizing piece, we've still got, our share of this mission type, which is high energy and high activity short breaks, is still relatively small. We're about 20% of that total market in terms of what people spend. So for me, it's much easier for me to be able to get somebody who looks like the person who comes now and get them to come as well, than it is to find something different and give them a different mission type or a different experience.
I like that. We can see how Jon is very strategic about, thinking through this, and deliberately also saying the things that are nice and shiny, i.e., the European customers noticing, well, there's something closer to home that is more sensible to go after. That's, a great strategist here.
See, there you go, spending time at Warwick Business School.
That's exactly what it is. We've not even paid him. So I wondered, Jon, in your experience then, you say that all of the brands that you've worked for at various levels, they've all been consumer facing. So to what extent, as an individual and a leadership member in whatever shape or form that takes in these, how aligned with the company, the values and the vision do you have to be as an individual to hold those positions, really get behind them and be successful in them?
It definitely helps. It makes a massive difference, and I think we're seeing this more with, if I look at my kids and going into their first careers now, I think being in a position where you work somewhere where you believe in what it is they're trying to do, rather than just, this is a job that I can go into and I'll do this for a period of time so I can get promoted. I think that really does matter. If you love what you do, you're much more likely to be successful in what it is that you do. So I do think that aligning yourself to what a business stands for and what it's about and what the culture feels like is really important. That's quite hard to do in a non-consumer facing business. So if you're B2B or you're a factory or something like that, if you're going to work in this organization, it's quite difficult to experience that. But one thing I love about consumer facing businesses, if you want to find out what it's like to work there, just go and sit in a store or go to a resort or go to whatever part of it is. And you see and you learn and you understand a lot about that business quite quickly just by seeing and experiencing it.
What's your take on that, Christian?
Yeah, I fully agree on this. What I can add is that all layers of bosses matter a lot in this as well. If you have a boss whom you hate, you're going to go in and hate the job regardless of whether in principle you like the idea. So hiring, getting the right people in, it's massively important, but I'm not spilling a big secret here.
No, it's true. It's been fascinating as we've progressed through Lead Out Loud, though, the gravity that has. You can think of a horrible boss and roll your eyes, or you can think of a horrible boss that people have actually quit over. And I think the values and the culture is, in my awareness anyway, it's becoming more important now that people are maybe working at a distance sometimes, or you're not all based at the same office all the time, and now that's changing a little bit more. I wonder whether the value on the culture is kind of more important now than it maybe ever has been because of that interconnectivity difference.
I don't know. I think culture has always been a really vital part to the success of an organisation. What seems to have changed, and Christian touched on it, but what seems to have changed over time is that individuals within organisations willing to say, I'm just going to quit because I'm not putting up with, I don't believe in this, or I'm not putting up with this person or that behaviour or so on. I think that's either it's more prevalent or it's certainly more discussed now than it probably ever has been before. So all three of my kids are in their 20s. If I look at how they interact over the world of work and what's important to them and what's not, I don't quite buy this thing that says, oh, Gen Z don't want to put any effort in and they don't do this and they don't. I've seen that I think it's lazy thinking. I've seen that in all age groups where there are people who work really hard and there are people who don't really do more than they absolutely must as a minimum. I think that happens all the time. I think what's clearer now is because of how people interact with each other and the information that's available about what's acceptable, what's not acceptable, I think the knowledge of that is much greater now. And so therefore you have to be better than ever about, first of all, managing a team and how you do that and how you bring people with you, but also as an organisation, how you bring people on board with this is what the culture is, this is what we stand for, and how you live to that as well. So if I look at what we did when we built our values and our leadership behaviours, we didn't, you mentioned before about external companies doing that. I understand why people do it because they're like, well, how do I do it? But we decided to do this ourselves. We have a really good people director who led us through on that. And so we put those together with listening groups and focus groups from within the business. And so as a consequence, when you talk to people about both values and leadership behaviours, they say, well, that feels like us. And I think that's the critical, that sounds like an ethereal statement, but I think that's a critical success factor with any of those things. Because if you can take your values or your leadership behaviours and just cut and paste them into any organisation, they probably don't resonate.
There's this catchphrase, culture eats strategy for breakfast, that's attributed to Peter Drucker. So we are, 50s, 60s. It's wrongly attributed to him, but the timing is probably right, yeah? And it just goes to show that that's always been true, that this really matters.
So when we're getting down to what a leader looks like that we want to rely on, and we can say, with them at the helm, our business is gonna go the distance. What do those attributes look like if we are being general about it?
It's very hard to be general because it's very situation specific. Probably one thing that is generally true is honesty. Yeah, if you are saying one thing one day and the next thing the next day, that doesn't typically resonate really well in the long run. Knowing when to sort of refer to others, I think, is also generally true. That it's not a problem to have limitations if you know who can help you with those. Yeah, I don't know if there's any others. Yeah, can't think of any because it's really quite situation specific.
They're good personality traits to have. The honesty bits to hold on to those.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So, John, what is it then, if we're thinking about personalities, that you look for if you're putting a team together?
That's a really tough question. What I've always tried to do with teams in the past is to make sure that I bring forward the best of what exists now and where we need fresh eyes, get that in as part of that. You see a number of people who will have teams that they've always had, and they will say, I come into a new organisation, I bring in this tribe of people that I've always worked with because those are the ones that I trust. I've never been a subscriber to that, really. I think it's super important to bring to the fore corporate memory. So people who have understood a business, why things have happened, the context of that, along with getting fresh eyes on what goes on. There's a couple of really critical things for team members for me. One of which is they have to be authentic. They have to be able to be their own person. I don't want them to try to fit a mold of something else. So I need a high level of authenticity from that person. And I think honesty is definitely an element of that really matters. What I'd like to see is I can see that person being the same person, whether they're in this room with this group of people or whether they're with their team or whether they're outside work. That's really critical to me. And I think the other one is people who are willing to work really hard on building the team that they're in. So even though I'm responsible ultimately for my leadership team, there is a lateral accountability between the people in my team to make sure that we're as good as we can be. And my expectation of them is that they also lean into that. They're not just responsible for their function, they're responsible for how we operate as a team. So I think that those two bits are really critical as well. Yeah. You also want people who don't take themselves too seriously. I do think that's important.
That's why we started today, wasn't it, actually?
What they don't need is charisma. Yeah, I think that's an interesting one for me. The danger with having sort of a charismatic superstar leading the organization organization is that they might lead you to places where you don't want to go. Now, in some cases, they also lead you to places where you wouldn't go otherwise, but it increases the risk substantially. I have a nice example for this, yeah. So Daimler in the 1980s got Edzard Reuter as a new CEO, and he's one of those people where you sit together with him for a while and you just buy into whatever he sells you. I had a coffee with him in Berlin a few years back in 2001, and we were talking about the period when he was in charge. I already knew going into this meeting that it was a disastrous failure. Mm-hmm. But by the end, I sort of started to think that, oh yeah, he was right. He would have just needed a little bit more time to do things. And this ability of him to get people to do things that they would never do but didn't really make sense in this organization was exactly the problem. Yeah. So, he made investments in the defense industry, which was pretty controversial in the 80s in Germany still, given the history from the Second World War. It was making acquisitions that were highly overpriced, and all of this eventually, did not work out. He was forced to resign. Daimler had to report the largest loss any German company had declared since the Second World War. But he nonetheless, is in a position to somehow convince you that what he was up to is right. It's a big danger, yeah? I feel if you have a charismatic superstar, and in the political domain, we might maybe a little bit more sensitive at the moment, where charisma can also make things happen that maybe is not so good for everyone.
Yeah, but how do you make that happen? You can't put in a job description also no charisma.
Yeah, I think there's a combination of things that work well to govern an organisation, and that comes from not just the individual but from above and from below as well. I think that the role of boards and the role that boards play in organising a business now is more important than it's ever been. I think what we're seeing, certainly in the UK, if I look at how this has evolved and listening to people who sit as both executive and non-executive directors in organisations, is the spotlight on them as individuals and the accountability of them as individuals has grown. Mm-hmm. It's not just a tick list exercise that people can step into boards because it means that their CV looks good. I think what they have to do now is be really accountable themselves and hold the executive team accountable. Yeah. So I think the way through that, it's quite difficult. I was listening to what you said about charisma, and then we can talk about what's happening in the US at the moment.
Yeah, we could.
Charisma question mark, but unfettered control. Mm-hmm. I think is really dangerous. And if you have somebody who is on a trip to do the things that just they want to do, that can be really bad. Hence, you need that level of governance at that point to make sure that we are making the right decisions. Mm. Part of the things that I really try to encourage over time with my team is that they challenge back. Certainly from anything that I've said. And I ask that question a lot about, tell me the things that I can do better. Tell me the things that I can improve in terms of how I work with you. And always make sure that if something's bothering you, if something's on your mind, whether it's in the group or whether it's individually, you have to tell me. And that encourages
the team and who they are.
Yes.
And selecting those people around you right at the beginning, and not yes people and people with the diverse backgrounds as in their experience and what they bring to a table. You want them to utilize and hold on to all of that to challenge.
Absolutely. I have to celebrate that, and I have to make sure that even when I'm uncomfortable and I'm doing something that people have said, I don't think that's the right thing to do, I have to take that on board and do something with it. All the way back to what we were talking about before with the leadership training program that we're working on at the moment. So the next stage to that for me is I'm in the resorts this week. I'm visiting. I'm going to talk to them about, right, how have you found this? What are you doing to implement that? What would you do differently? So that we encourage as much as possible people to speak up and have a view on what it is that they're seeing. I don't want them to do that in a negative or a disrespectful way. We all need to respect each other in terms of how we have conversations. But if the point is we're doing things that make the business better, then I want people to have an opinion. It's a really dangerous place when you have a hierarchy that controls everything from the top and doesn't take feedback.
It sounds like that's exactly what your example was.
That's precisely what it is, yeah. And to find modes where this is possible, that people can speak up and you can hear them as well.
Would you say that's down to the individual leader and their style? Or would you say that perhaps some of the culture within the organisation plays into it?
Well, these things, They're all interlinked. Yeah. Obviously, if you have a leader who doesn't want to have people to speak up and is uncomfortable, he or she is likely to discourage this. Yeah. Now, an organization which has a culture that wants this to happen is more likely to choose a leader who is doing this. Yeah. Hence this interlink. Yeah. On top of this, you need to find modes, processes that enable you to do this as well. Some of it can be quite informal. Sometimes it makes sense if you put some structure into this process as well. I don't know, maybe, for example, if you work on the next round of strategic renewal, then set up a process that puts different voices into the room and that people can air their opinions on this. That's usually a crucial point to do so. Some organizations work well with some form of online forums where people voice this. So it depends really, your organization will find the right mode that is best for you.
No, that's interesting, because I'm thinking about the way that culture, when faced with change, and how that functions. And you've given us an example of how it can go really wrong. But, the concept of anticipating change, how might that come into play if you've got culture A there, where you've got a kind of dictatorial setup, versus one that Jon describes of a kind of two-way conversation, open, honest and authentic?
So in fact, many of the ideas that are fruitful, providing you with new directions, are likely to come from somewhere inside the organization. You need to find ways to amplify them. New strategic ideas are often a bit sort of anomalies which flirt around somewhere in your organization. You need to find ways to spot them, to give them some room, and to then bring them to the attention of the top leaders. In this sense, you don't need to have this one person in charge who knows the future entirely, but if you find ways to listen, then you can get these ideas. Important to keep in mind as well, we tend to put a lot of emphasis on the content, the idea what the strategy stands for. But most strategies don't fail because the idea is right or wrong. Most of them fail because the execution goes wrong. There's various surveys on this, but we sit between 60 and 90% of the reason why something fails is because people don't implement this stuff. There's an interesting survey that looked simply at the question whether people know what the main strategic priorities are. And they had, I think if I remember correctly, about 4,000 people which were surveyed, 140 organizations. Even in the executive team, only 50% of the members of the executive team could name the main three strategic priorities of this organization. When you went down to the front line, it was 18%. It shows us where the problem sits, and you need to constantly repeat that, which is not easy to do, considering for you as the person in charge, you do this every day. You automatically assume everyone else will know what it is, But find constant reminders, and you're thinking you're boring everyone to death. Turns out they need to be bored to death, that they're really ingrained.
Yeah, and thinking about a company with the size of Butlins and with, so many different people at all different levels all over the country, do you find that because it's customer facing, that's, I don't know, maybe even more important that the values are shared and instilled at every single level?
Well, I completely relate to what Christian said, because I think that still our biggest strategic risk right now is execution risk. And I think that becomes even more prevalent in a world where money is tight and people are being really careful, and we've got a load of on costs coming in our direction, and how we manage that through is really important. And that is our biggest challenge, is getting that information across to every team member, because not everybody at all levels is great at managing and communicating with their teams. So this was part of what we did with our leadership program that we've done recently. There's still ongoing. Is how do we refine this down to the things that really matter and what we'd need to see day to day in the organisation for us to succeed in the areas that we want to. And we've been talking about the core points of our strategy for 3-4 years now. And there are still people who it doesn't resonate with and don't really get it. Fortunately, I'm delighted to say that everyone in my team understands it really well. That would be a worry, seeing as they're doing it. That would be more worrying. Yeah. I think this is where you blend how you behave day to day, what your actions are with what you design into your organization. And so, for example, if we take our values, these needed to be ones that every team member could understand what they are and they resonated with them in their day job and they could apply it to their day job. That takes quite a bit of time to refine that. You get to very few words, and then when you have those conversations with them in things like coffee chats, how are you, how are things going, first 90 days, how are you feeling about these things? You need to engineer that into part of what we talk about. And that takes a while to start with. After a while, it then becomes more commonplace. But when you have a team turnover level, which is about 30-something%, which is where we are, which is fairly normal for our industry, then you think that a third of people come in and they haven't heard this before. How do we make sure that they're part of that as well and they start working that way as early as possible? So it's a never-ending cycle of making sure that every single team member in the organisation understands what it is we're trying to achieve and why.
And I like the reference there to never ending. That's exactly, it's a kind of continuous effort to instill that across the board. No, I really like that. Well, we are swiftly running out of time. So I'd like to thank you both, first of all, for your inputs today. And I just wondered whether you might give us a kind of, we call it the bottom line. So the main thing that you want our listeners to take away from today's conversation, other than your profits are higher when you're open.
That definitely wouldn't be the one thing. I reckon that everybody listening would know that straight away. From my point of view, I think the critical bit is, in a consumer-facing business like this, is how do you make sure that all of your team members who are facing your guests really understand what it is that their role is, what they do well, what they don't do well, and how we celebrate the stuff that goes well and how we help them with the stuff that doesn't go well. Because back to the execution risk point, that's where we'll either get it right or wrong.
No, thank you. And Christian, how do leaders make sure their businesses last?
Open up your strategy. You'll not be surprised. I wrote a book about this. But the good news for leaders is you're not alone. There's many people you can rely on. If you want to do this, reach out to Warwick. We'll help you.
Absolutely. Well, again, thank you both for our guests for sharing their experience today. And remember, you can subscribe for more leadership insights. You can follow us on LinkedIn, TikTok, and Instagram. And we'll see you next time on Lead Out Loud.